After 45 years of marriage, her billionaire husband dumped her, leaving her with nothing but a rotting, rat-infested cabin in the deep woods. It was meant to be his final, cruel insult, but beneath those decaying floorboards hid a secret that would make her unimaginably wealthy overnight. The mahogany-paneled walls of the Maricopa County Superior Court felt more like a tomb than a hall of justice. Margaret Peggy Mitchell, 71 years old and wearing her best conservative navy suit, sat with her hands folded tightly in her lap. Her knuckles were white, the only outward sign of the tremor rattling her frail frame. Beside her sat her court-appointed attorney, Donovan Hayes, a young public defender who looked hopelessly outmatched. Across the aisle sat the man she had loved for nearly half a century. Gregory Mitchell was 74, but money and meticulous cosmetic procedures made him look 55. He was flanked by 3 high-powered divorce attorneys in bespoke Italian suits. Gregory didn't look at Peggy. He was too busy checking the Rolex Daytona on his wrist, radiating the bored impatience of a man waiting for a delayed flight. In the matter of Mitchell versus Mitchell, Judge Harold T. Jenkins announced, his voice echoing off the high ceilings. After reviewing the financial disclosures, the prenuptial agreement signed in 1978, and the forensic accounting reports, this court is ready to issue the final decree of dissolution. Peggy closed her eyes. She knew what was coming. For 2 years, Gregory's legal team had waged a ruthless war of attrition against her. When Peggy and Gregory married, they had nothing. She had been a public school teacher. He had been a struggling truck driver with big dreams. Peggy had cashed out her modest teacher's pension to buy Gregory his first 2 commercial freight trucks. For the first 10 years of their marriage, she had done the dispatching from their tiny kitchen table in Phoenix, staying up until 3 in the morning to balance the ledgers while Gregory drove the routes. Together, they built Mitchell Freight and Logistics into a multi-hundred-million-dollar empire. But as the company grew, Gregory shrank away from her. The late nights at the office turned into business trips to Miami and Monaco. The final blow had come 6 months ago when Peggy discovered Gregory was not only having an affair with a 26-year-old marketing executive named Savannah, but that Savannah was pregnant. When Peggy filed for divorce, she assumed the law would protect her. She had been a partner in everything, but Gregory had spent the last decade preparing for this exact moment. He had quietly transferred the bulk of his wealth into impenetrable offshore trusts in the Cayman Islands, shell companies in Delaware, and complex corporate entities that Peggy's underfunded legal team simply could not pierce. Worse, his lawyers had weaponized a vaguely worded, decades-old prenuptial agreement that Peggy had signed when they were practically children, which waived her right to his future business acquisitions. The court finds that the plaintiff, Mr. Mitchell, has adequately demonstrated that the core assets of Mitchell Freight and Logistics are insulated from community property laws. Judge Jenkins droned on reading from his thick stack of papers. Therefore, the primary residence in Scottsdale, the property in Aspen, and the associated liquid capital will remain with the plaintiff. Peggy let out a shaky breath. Everything. He was getting everything. The custom-built mansion she had designed, the retirement accounts, the art collection she had painstakingly curated. Regarding spousal support, the judge continued, given the defendant's prior career and the limited liquid assets strictly defined as marital property, Mr. Mitchell is ordered to pay a lump sum of $50,000 along with ownership of the defendant's current vehicle, the 2012 Honda Civic. $50,000. To a man worth over $400 million, it was pocket change. To Peggy, it was barely enough to survive a few years in a modest apartment. Finally, Judge Jenkins looked over his glasses. In the spirit of equitable distribution of the remaining physical real estate, the deed to parcel 402, located in Carroll County, Arkansas, shall be transferred entirely to the defendant, Mrs. Mitchell. A cruel, suppressed snicker echoed from Gregory's table. Peggy opened her eyes and finally looked at her ex-husband. Gregory caught her gaze and flashed a tight, patronizing smile. Parcel 402. Peggy knew exactly what that was. It was 50 acres of dense, swampy, mosquito-infested woods in the Ozarks, purchased back in the 1980s by Gregory's paranoid, reclusive Uncle Albert. Albert had built an off-the-grid survivalist cabin on the property, convinced the world was going to end. When Albert died, the property passed to Gregory, who had laughed about it for years, refusing to even visit the place, calling it his redneck inheritance. Gregory had intentionally listed it in the marital assets just to saddle Peggy with the property taxes and the burden of a worthless, unsellable piece of land. "Court is adjourned," Judge Jenkins declared, banging his gavel. The sound felt like a coffin slamming shut. Peggy stood up on shaky legs. Her lawyer, Donovan, offered a sympathetic wince. "I'm so sorry, Peggy. We just didn't have the resources to trace the offshore accounts. He buried the money too deep." "It's all right, Donovan," she whispered, her voice surprisingly steady. She gathered her worn leather purse. As she walked down the courthouse steps into the blinding Arizona sun, Gregory fell into step beside her. His bodyguards hovered a few feet away. "No hard feelings, Peg," Gregory said smoothly, adjusting his silk tie. "It's just business. You know how it is. You should sell that Arkansas dump. It might cover your groceries for a year or two." Peggy stopped and looked at the man she had dedicated her life to. She saw the sheer arrogance in his eyes, the absolute certainty that he had won. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. "You built an empire on the money I gave you, Gregory," she said softly. "You may have hidden the money from the judge, but you can't hide who you are." Gregory chuckled, slipping his designer sunglasses over his eyes. "Enjoy your retirement in the swamp, Peggy." 2 weeks later, the blistering Arizona desert gave way to the suffocating humidity of the Arkansas Ozarks. Peggy gripped the steering wheel of her sputtering Honda Civic. The air conditioning having died somewhere outside of Albuquerque, the $50,000 settlement was frozen in an escrow account, delayed by Gregory's lawyers over a clerical error. She had exactly $840 in her checking account. She had nowhere else to go. According to the faded county map she had picked up at a gas station in Eureka Springs parcel 402, was located at the end of a heavily rutted dirt logging road that hadn't seen a county plow in 30 years. As her tires crunched over the gravel and overgrown weeds, the dense canopy of oak and hickory trees blocked out the afternoon sun, plunging the road into a damp, greenish twilight. For a terrifying hour, Peggy thought she was lost. But then the trees parted slightly, revealing a small, overgrown clearing. Peggy put the car in park and stared through the mud-splattered windshield. Her heart sank into her stomach. Oh, dear God," she whispered. Uncle Albert's cabin was not just dilapidated. It looked like a structural corpse smothered in a thick, choking blanket of kudzu and poison ivy. The single-story structure sagged heavily in the center. The rusted tin roof was missing large patches, exposing rotting timber underneath. The front porch had partially collapsed, the wooden steps shattered and gray with age. The windows were either smashed or boarded up with decaying plywood. It wasn't a home. It was a nightmare. Peggy stepped out of the car. The smell of mildew, wet earth, and wild animal droppings hit her instantly. The silence of the woods was oppressive, broken only by the aggressive buzz of cicadas. She was 71 years old, alone, thousands of miles from the life she knew, staring at the physical manifestation of her ex-husband's cruelty. For the first time since the judge's gavel fell, Peggy collapsed against the hood of her car and wept. She cried for the youth she had given Gregory, for the children they never had, for the sheer indignity of standing in a swamp with nothing to her name but a ruined shack. But Margaret O'Connell had not survived 45 years with a ruthless shark by being weak. After 10 minutes, she wiped her face with the back of her sleeve. She marched to the trunk of the Civic, pulled out a heavy flashlight and a crowbar she had bought at a hardware store, and approached the ruin. She had to clean it up, even if it was just enough to take decent photos to sell the land to a logging company or a local hunter for $5,000. It was all she had. Using the crowbar, she pried the jammed front door open. It shrieked on rusted hinges, revealing an interior that was somehow worse than the outside. The cabin consisted of 2 rooms, a main living area with a rusted cast-iron wood stove, and a small bedroom. The floors were thick with dead leaves, raccoon droppings, and the shredded remains of whatever furniture Uncle Albert had left behind. Determined, Peggy spent the next 3 days living out of her car, surviving on peanut butter sandwiches and bottled water. From dawn until dusk she wore heavy work gloves and a dust mask, shoveling out debris, tearing down the dead vines that had invaded through the broken windows, and scrubbing the filthy walls. It was exhausting, back-breaking work. Every muscle in her elderly body screamed in agony, but the manual labor kept the despair at bay. On the afternoon of her fourth day, the muggy Arkansas air suddenly grew cold and still. The sky turned a bruised, violent purple. A severe summer thunderstorm was rolling over the Ozarks. Peggy hurried inside the cabin just as the heavens opened up. Torrential rain hammered the rusted tin roof, sounding like a continuous roar of artillery. Lightning strobed through the gaps in the boarded windows, illuminating the dust swirling in the air. So Peggy heard a sickening crack from above. The structural integrity of the roof, weakened by decades of rot, finally gave out under the sheer weight of the downpour. A massive section of the ceiling directly above the center of the living room caved in, bringing down a cascade of water-rotten timber and decades of sludge directly onto the oak floorboards. Peggy scrambled backward, coughing as a cloud of debris filled the room. The water from the roof poured directly onto the floor, pooling rapidly. "No, no, no!" Peggy cried out, grabbing a rusted tin bucket to try and catch the water. She rushed forward, desperate to save the floor she had spent 2 days scrubbing. Snorts. But as she stepped onto the soaked oak planks in the center of the room, she felt a terrifying sponginess beneath her boots. Uncle Albert hadn't used treated lumber. The floor had been rotting from the bottom up for 30 years. With a sound like a snapping bone, the floorboards gave way. Peggy shrieked as the ground vanished beneath her feet. She plunged downward into absolute darkness, falling in a shower of splintered wood, muddy water, and debris. She landed hard, the breath blasting out of her lungs on impact. She lay there in the pitch black, gasping, her shoulder throbbing with blinding pain. Cold water dripped onto her face from the gaping hole 8 FT above her. Panic seized her chest. She was trapped in a crawl space under a collapsed cabin in the middle of a storm. No one knew she was here. No one was coming for her. "Help!" she screamed, though she knew it was useless. Shivering and bruised, Peggy felt around in the dark sludge until her hand brushed against the cold metal of her flashlight, which had fallen with her. Miraculously, the heavy-duty casing had survived. She clicked the heavy rubber button. A bright beam of LED light pierced the darkness. Peggy blinked, wiping the muddy water from her eyes. As the beam swept across her surroundings, her breath hitched. She wasn't in a dirt crawl space. She was sitting on a smooth, poured concrete floor. She slowly got to her feet, ignoring the searing pain in her shoulder, and aimed the flashlight around. The space beneath the cabin was massive, at least twice the size of the footprint of the house above. It was a reinforced subterranean concrete bunker. The air down here was incredibly dry and perfectly cool, wholly unaffected by the humidity above. Uncle Albert hadn't just been a casual survivalist, he had built a fortress. The flashlight beam tracked along the concrete walls, passing over rows of industrial metal shelving. Most of the shelves held decades-old military rations and rusted water barrels. But at the far end of the bunker, something caught the light, reflecting it back with a dull, heavy sheen. Peggy slowly walked toward the back wall. Her boots echoed in the cavernous space. Sitting flush against the concrete wall was a massive vintage Mosler bank safe, at least 6F tall and 4F wide. It was painted a faded olive drab with a heavy brass combination dial in the center. Next to the safe sat 6 large, heavy-duty wooden crates stamped with faded black ink. Peggy aimed the light at the crates. The wood was dry but incredibly old. Using the adrenaline pumping through her veins, she picked up a crowbar from the rubble, wedged it under the lid of the nearest crate, and leaned her entire body weight onto it. The ancient iron nails squealed in protest before the lid popped off with a dusty thud. Peggy aimed the flashlight inside. She froze. The flashlight nearly slipped from her trembling fingers. The crate was packed meticulously with vacuum-sealed heavy plastic bags. Inside the bags were neatly stacked, pristine bundles of paper. But it wasn't just paper. Peggy reached in with a shaking hand, pulled out one of the sealed bricks, and brought it close to the light. They were treasury bonds. Bearer bonds, to be exact, each one stamped with ornate ink, completely untraceable, and functioning exactly like cash. She squinted at the denomination printed in the corner of the top certificate. $10,000, there were hundreds of them in this bag alone, and there were at least 30 bags in the crate. Her heart hammered wildly against her ribs. She moved the light to the next crate, the lid already slightly loose. She pried it open. Instead of paper, this crate was filled with rows of small, incredibly heavy rectangular blocks wrapped in faded wax paper. Peggy tore the wax paper off the nearest block. The heavy metal beneath gleamed with a soft, unmistakable yellow luster, solid gold bullion. Peggy fell to her knees on the cold concrete. Uncle Albert hadn't just been crazy. He had been terrified of banks, and he had possessed the kind of generational wealth that even Gregory didn't know about. And because Gregory had insisted on giving her this property in its entirety to avoid paying her a dime of alimony, he had legally, unknowingly, handed her the deed to the entire fortune. Peggy looked up at the gaping hole in the ceiling, the rain still pouring in. A slow, unfamiliar sound escaped her lips. It started as a gasp, then turned into a chuckle, and finally erupted into a full-throated, echoing laugh. The game wasn't over. It had only just begun. For a long time, Peggy merely sat on the freezing concrete floor of the bunker, surrounded by the ghosts of Uncle Albert's profound paranoia. The bearer bonds resting in her lap were not just pieces of paper. They were instruments of untraceable financial power issued by the United States Treasury in the early 1980s before the government outlawed their issuance to prevent tax evasion. These specific certificates belonged entirely to whoever physically held them. There was no registry. There was no digital footprint. To the IRS, to the banking system, and most importantly, to Gregory's ruthless team of forensic accountants, this wealth simply did not exist. Once the initial shock subsided, a cold, calculating clarity washed over Peggy. She carefully wrapped the gold bullion back into its wax paper and placed the bearer bonds inside the heavy wooden crates. Using her flashlight to navigate, she found a rusted but functional metal ladder bolted to the concrete wall leading up to a heavy steel trapdoor that Uncle Albert had cleverly disguised beneath the false oak floorboards. Peggy climbed out of the bunker, her muscles screaming in protest, and emerged into the humid aftermath of the Arkansas thunderstorm. The air smelled of ozone and shattered pine. She drove her sputtering Honda Civic 3 hours to the city of Bentonville, where she walked into a sterile, brightly lit electronics store and purchased a prepaid cellular phone with cash. Sitting in the parking lot of a local diner, Peggy dialed a number she had found in the financial pages of a newspaper she had scavenged. It belonged to Harrison Caldwell, a senior partner at Caldwell, Shaw & Partners, an elite wealth management and legal firm based in Manhattan that specialized in ultra-high net worth individuals and discreet asset protection. "Mr. Caldwell," Peggy said when the man finally answered his private line, her voice steady and commanding. "My name is Margaret Mitchell. I require immediate legal representation regarding the sudden acquisition of unregistered physical assets, specifically several £100 of Credit Suisse gold bullion and approximately $50 million in mature United States Treasury bearer bonds." There was a long, stunned silence on the other end of the line. "Mrs. Mitchell, if this is a prank—" "I can assure you, Mr. Caldwell, it is not," Peggy interrupted smoothly. "I am sitting in a diner in Arkansas, and the assets are secured in a subterranean vault. I need you to fly down here immediately with a certified appraiser and a secure transport team. I will pay your firm a retainer of $1 million the moment the bonds are authenticated." 24 hours later, a sleek black Gulfstream jet touched down at the nearest private airfield. Harrison Caldwell, a sharp-eyed man in a tailored charcoal suit, arrived at Parcel 402 accompanied by 2 heavily armed former military contractors and an independent financial appraiser. When Peggy led them down the rusted ladder and into the bunker, Caldwell lost his professional composure, whispering a quiet oath as the flashlight beams reflected off the stacked gold. Over the next 48 hours, an intricate, highly covert operation unfolded in the deep woods of the Ozarks. Caldwell's legal mind worked brilliantly, because Judge Harold T. Jenkins had specifically written the divorce decree to grant Peggy the deed to parcel 402 and all physical fixtures and contents therein, a malicious clause inserted by Gregory's own lawyers to ensure Peggy was burdened with clearing out the garbage. Every single ounce of gold and every bond legally belonged to her. Gregory had signed away his rights to the fortune in his desperate rush to humiliate her. Under the cover of darkness, 2 armored transport trucks navigated the rutted logging road. The crates were loaded, secured, and driven across state lines to a private depository in Nevada. Simultaneously, Caldwell established the Pinecrest Heritage Trust in Wyoming, a state renowned for its impenetrable corporate privacy laws. Peggy's newfound wealth was systematically integrated into the trust, washed clean through a series of complex, perfectly legal financial maneuvers. But back in Phoenix, a dangerous wrinkle emerged. Bradley Jenkins, a junior accountant working for Gregory's firm, was reviewing the finalized divorce documents to close out the fiscal year. While scanning the property taxes for parcel 402, Bradley noticed a strange municipal addendum from 1985 referencing a commercial-grade subterranean concrete pour. Confused as to why a worthless wooden shack would require a commercial foundation, Bradley brought the anomaly to Gregory's attention. Gregory, always suspicious, immediately hired a private investigator to drive up to Arkansas and check the property. The investigator arrived at the overgrown clearing exactly 12 hours after Caldwell's armored trucks had departed. He found nothing but a caved-in rotting cabin and a muddy Clear's throat hole in the floor that looked like a simple, collapsed root cellar. Peggy's tracks had been completely washed away by another summer rainstorm. The investigator snapped a few photos of the miserable wreckage and sent them to Gregory with a simple text message. "Nothing here but swamp and rot. Your ex-wife isn't even here." Sitting in his glass-walled corner office, Gregory laughed, deleted the photos, and went back to his life completely unaware that he had just surrendered an $80 million empire to the woman he had destroyed. 2 years later, Margaret Mitchell no longer existed. She went by Margaret O'Connell, residing in a spectacular Swiss penthouse, cured of her tremors and dressed in custom cashmere. She had methodically multiplied Uncle Albert's massive fortune through a trust. She was now a silent billionaire. Gregory Mitchell, however, was spiraling into corporate hell. Believing himself invincible after the divorce, he over-leveraged his logistics company using hidden offshore accounts. When a global supply chain crisis bottlenecked shipping, his new automated fleet sat idle, hemorrhaging cash. Desperate, Gregory resorted to cooking his corporate books. The Securities and Exchange Commission noticed the discrepancies immediately. Federal agents raided his headquarters. Authorities froze his offshore accounts. His wife filed for divorce and fled. Angry creditors threatened to violently dismantle the company. Facing federal prison, Gregory prepared for bankruptcy. Suddenly, a lifeline appeared. A shadowy Swiss private equity firm called O'Connell Holdings submitted an aggressive buyout offer. They offered to purchase all outstanding debt and assume all legal liabilities. The catch was brutal. Gregory would be permanently ousted, and he would receive exactly $50,000 in severance. It was humiliating. It was exactly what he had given Peggy, but he had no choice. The final acquisition meeting took place in a towering Manhattan skyscraper. Gregory, looking prematurely aged and completely defeated, walked slowly into the vast mahogany boardroom. He wore a rumpled, ill-fitting suit that hung loosely on his shrinking frame. At the far end of the long conference table sat Harrison Caldwell, meticulously reviewing legal contracts. "Mr. Mitchell," Caldwell said, his tone completely devoid of warmth. "Please take a seat. The majority shareholder of O'Connell Holdings will be joining us momentarily to finalize signatures." Gregory sank heavily into a plush leather chair, aggressively rubbing his bloodshot eyes. Let us just get this terrible ordeal over with. I do not care who the buyer is anymore. Just give me the damn pen." The heavy oak doors at the back of the boardroom clicked open. The distinct sound of steady heels echoed sharply across the polished marble floor. Gregory did not bother looking up until a distinctly familiar scent of expensive lavender perfume drifted across the table. He slowly raised his heavy head, his bleary eyes focusing on the elegant figure standing at the head of the boardroom. Peggy stood there, radiating an aura of untouchable power and quiet grace. She wore a sharp, beautifully tailored white Armani suit, a stunning string of authentic Mikimoto pearls resting flawlessly against her collarbone. She looked 20 years younger than the frail, thoroughly broken woman he had callously left weeping on the courthouse steps. Gregory's jaw dropped. The color drained entirely from his face, leaving him a sickening, ashen shade of gray. His brain violently rejected the impossible reality. "Peggy?" he choked out, his voice cracking pitifully. "What are you doing here? You're supposed to be in Arkansas." Peggy smiled. It was not a cruel smile, but one of profound, deeply serene satisfaction. She gracefully pulled out the leather chair at the head of the table and sat down, folding her perfectly manicured hands neatly in her lap. "I was in Arkansas, Gregory," Peggy said, her voice smooth, calm, and echoing perfectly in the quiet, tense room. For a little while, at least, until a severe summer thunderstorm caved in the rotting roof of Uncle Albert's isolated cabin. Gregory stared at her, completely uncomprehending. "Albert's cabin? What does that have to do with anything? How are you sitting in that chair?" "You always were too arrogant to look beneath the surface of absolutely anything," Peggy said softly, leaning forward. "You thought you were punishing me by giving me parcel 402. You were so busy gloating over your offshore accounts and your clever legal tricks that you never bothered to check what your paranoid uncle was actually hiding underneath those rotting floorboards. Did you know he never trusted banks, Gregory? Did you know he spent the entire 1980s converting his massive logistics dividends into physical gold and untraceable bearer bonds?" Gregory stopped breathing. The room seemed to spin violently around him, the pieces slammed together in his mind with the force of a speeding freight train. The sudden buyout, the exact $50,000 severance, the private equity firm named O'Connell. "You!" Gregory gasped, clutching his chest as a massive wave of pure panic crashed over him. "You stole it! That was my family's money! That was my inheritance!" "No, Gregory," Harrison Caldwell interjected coldly, tapping the thick divorce decree resting on the table. "According to the binding legal document drafted by your own legal team and signed by a superior court judge, you definitively and permanently surrendered all rights, claims, and ownership of the property and its physical contents to your former wife. Legally speaking, you gave her the greatest gift of her life." Peggy picked up a solid gold fountain pen from the table. She uncapped it with a soft click and pushed the final acquisition contract across the polished mahogany toward her ruined ex-husband. "You built an empire using the money I gave you when we were young, Gregory," Peggy said, echoing the exact words she had spoken on the courthouse steps. "And you tried to leave me with absolutely nothing. But the universe has a very funny way of balancing the scales." Gregory looked down at the contract. His hands were shaking so violently he could barely hold the pen Caldwell offered him. He looked at the $50,000 figure printed at the very bottom of the page. It was his entire net worth now. He had nothing else. His mansions were gone. His wife was gone. His company was gone. He was 76 years old, and he was starting over with the exact same pathetic sum he had tossed to Peggy like garbage. With a broken sob, Gregory signed the contract. Peggy took the paper, stood up, and adjusted her white jacket. "Enjoy your retirement," she whispered, leaving him alone in the silence. What would you do if the ultimate betrayal led you to a life-changing fortune? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. If you love this incredible true-to-life story of karma and sweet revenge, make sure to hit that like button, share this video with your friends, and subscribe to our channel for the final mind-blowing parts of Margaret's journey. Turn on notifications so you never miss an update.